Picture this. It's 1944. You're a German soldier, captured somewhere in North Africa or France. You're terrified because you've been told for years that Americans are brutal, that capture means torture, starvation, maybe death. You're loaded onto a ship, crossing the Atlantic, convinced you're sailing toward your doom. Then the ship docks. You're herded off, processed, and loaded onto a train. The train travels for hours, maybe days. When it finally stops, you step out into Iowa, or Texas, or Wisconsin. There are no guard towers with machine guns, no barbed wire electrified fences. Instead, there's a baseball field, a canteen selling Coca-Cola, a library. And tomorrow morning, you'll be driven to a farm where you'll pick cotton or harvest wheat, and you'll be paid for it. Paid in American dollars. This sounds like fiction, right? Like some alternate history novel? But this actually happened to over 400,000 German prisoners of war held on American soil during World War II. And their story is so strange, so unexpected, so completely different from what we imagine about POW camps that most people today have no idea it even occurred.
Here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. These weren't just prison camps. They were, in many ways, functioning communities. German POWs in America lived lives that were, by almost any measure, better than the lives of soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, better than civilians back home in bombed-out German cities, and in some cases, better than many Americans living through the Depression's lingering effects. Some prisoners gained weight while in captivity. Some learned trades. Some fell in love with American towns and returned after the war to live there permanently. And all of this happened while their countrymen were committing some of history's worst atrocities, while American soldiers were dying in Europe to defeat Nazi Germany. The contradiction is jarring. It raises uncomfortable questions. How could America treat enemy soldiers so well? Why did they do it? And what happened when these men, fed on Nazi propaganda, encountered the reality of American life? The answers reveal something profound about American strategy, international law, economic necessity, and the strange, sometimes surreal nature of World War II on the home front.
Let's start with scope, because the numbers are staggering. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States held approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners of war within its borders. The vast majority, about 371,000, were German. The rest were primarily Italian, with a smaller number of Japanese POWs held in separate facilities. To put this in perspective, that's more enemy prisoners than the number of Americans living in Miami at the time. It's roughly the population of Minneapolis. These weren't scattered in a handful of camps either. The U.S. military established over 500 POW camps across the country, from the Mojave Desert to the forests of Maine, from the Louisiana Bayou to the plains of Nebraska. But here's where it gets interesting. Most Americans had no idea this was happening. The government deliberately spread these camps across rural areas away from major population centers. There were strategic reasons for this: security concerns, preventing escape to Mexico or Canada, minimizing contact with the general population. But there was also a more practical reason: labor. American farms were hemorrhaging workers. Millions of young men had enlisted or been drafted. Agricultural production needed to increase dramatically to feed both the American population and Allied forces overseas. Someone needed to pick that cotton, harvest that wheat, cut that timber. The solution? Put POWs to work. It was legal under the Geneva Convention, provided they were paid, treated humanely, and not forced to contribute directly to the war effort. So that's exactly what happened.
Now, to understand why the POW experience was so shocking to German soldiers, you need to understand what they expected. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as soft, decadent, mongrel people, a nation weakened by racial mixing and Jewish influence. But it had also portrayed them as cruel and lawless, capable of atrocities. German soldiers were told contradictory things.
Americans were too weak to fight effectively, but also savage enough to torture and execute prisoners. When soldiers were captured, often in North Africa during the campaigns of 1942-43, or later in Italy and France, they were processed quickly. The Americans were efficient, almost businesslike about it. Prisoners were searched, documented, given basic medical care if needed. Then came the journey. Most German POWs were transported across the Atlantic in the same ships that had brought American troops to Europe. The voyage took roughly 2 weeks. Conditions varied. Some ships were crowded and uncomfortable, others less so. But POWs were generally given adequate food and water, which itself was surprising to many who expected starvation rations. Upon arrival in ports like New York, Norfolk, or Boston, the real culture shock began. America had not been bombed. The cities were intact, brightly lit at night, bustling with activity. After years of war in Europe, where cities were reduced to rubble and civilians scrounged for food, this was almost incomprehensible. One German prisoner later wrote, "We could not believe our eyes. Everything was whole. There was food in shops. People were laughing." From the ports, prisoners were transported inland by train. The U.S. Army used regular passenger trains for this, often at night to avoid public attention. The prisoners would see America rolling past their windows, endless farmland, small towns, factories humming with production. For soldiers who had been told America was weak and failing, this was cognitive dissonance on a massive scale.
When prisoners arrived at their assigned camps, what they found defied every expectation. Let me describe a typical camp based on records from places like Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Hearn in Texas, and Camp Como in Mississippi. The camps were built quickly, usually using standardized Army designs, rows of tar paper barracks, mess halls, recreation buildings, sometimes even theaters. They were surrounded by fences, yes, but often just single chain-link fences, sometimes not even topped with barbed wire. Guard towers existed, but they were sparsely manned. Escape attempts were rare, and we'll get to why in a moment. Inside the fence, prisoners lived in a world that was, by wartime standards, remarkably comfortable. Barracks housed about 50 men each, with individual cots, mattresses, and blankets. They weren't luxurious, but they were warm in winter, adequately ventilated in summer, and far superior to frontline conditions or even many German military barracks. Each camp had shower facilities with hot water, latrines that were regularly serviced, and medical clinics staffed by captured German doctors and medics, supervised by American medical officers. The food was the first major shock. The Geneva Convention mandated that POWs receive the same rations as the soldiers of the capturing nation. In practice, this meant German prisoners in America ate better than most German civilians back home, and in many cases, better than German soldiers in the field. Daily rations included meat, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and milk. The USDA worked with the War Department to ensure camps had access to regional agricultural surplus. A camp in Wisconsin might have abundant dairy. A camp in Texas might have more beef. Prisoners in Louisiana got rice and local seafood. One former POW named Reinhold Pobel later wrote, "We could not understand it. We ate white bread, real butter, as much as we wanted. There was meat almost every day. We thought this cannot be real prison." Another prisoner, Georg Gartner, recalled, "I gained 15 pounds in my first 3 months. I had been hungry for years in the Wehrmacht. In the American camp, I was never hungry." This wasn't universal. Some camps had better food than others, and there were occasional complaints, but on average, the caloric intake and nutritional quality exceeded what most prisoners had experienced in years. Now we come to the centerpiece of the POW system, the labor program. This is where things get really interesting because it reveals the pragmatic genius of the American approach. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to work with certain restrictions.
They couldn't be forced to do war production, no building tanks or ammunition, but they could do agricultural work, forestry, infrastructure maintenance, and other non-military labor. And they had to be paid. Here's how it worked. The U.S. government would contract with private companies, farms, or municipalities that needed labor. Prisoners would be transported, usually by truck, sometimes by bus, from their camps to work sites. They'd work a standard 8-hour day, sometimes longer during harvest season. For this work, they received 80 cents per day. Now, 80 cents doesn't sound like much, and by American standards it wasn't. American factory workers were making several dollars per day. But remember, these men were prisoners. They had no expenses. Housing, food, clothing, medical care, all provided. That 80 cents was pure discretionary income. Prisoners could spend this money at the camp canteen, which sold cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing supplies, and sometimes beer. Yes, beer. Some camps allowed prisoners to purchase a limited amount of beer, typically 3.2% alcohol content, the same as what was sold on army bases. They could also send money home to Germany through the International Red Cross, though many chose not to, knowing how little it would buy in the devastated German economy. Some saved their earnings, planning for after the war. A prisoner who worked diligently for 2 or 3 years could accumulate over $500, a substantial sum at the time, equivalent to several months of wages for an American worker. The work itself varied dramatically. In the South, POWs picked cotton, a back-breaking job that had historically been done by enslaved people and later by sharecroppers. This created its own bizarre situations, German prisoners working alongside black Americans in a segregated society where the prisoners sometimes received better treatment than the black workers. In the Midwest, they harvested wheat and corn. In the Northwest, they cut timber in forests. In California, they picked fruit in the vast agricultural valleys. In New Jersey and New York, they worked in canning factories. Some became skilled at these jobs, taking pride in their work despite being prisoners of war. Farmers generally liked the POW labor. The men were disciplined, accustomed to following orders, and often hardworking. Many were from rural areas of Germany themselves and knew agricultural work. There were occasional conflicts, language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, prisoners who refused to work efficiently, but overall the program functioned smoothly. The Army mediated disputes, punished prisoners who shirked duties, and compensated farmers fairly. By 1944, at the peak of the program, German POWs were contributing over 100 million labor hours annually to the American economy, particularly in agriculture.
But work was only part of the POW experience. What did these men do with the rest of their time? This is where the story becomes almost surreal. When prisoners weren't working, they had considerable freedom to organize their own lives within the camp. The Army's philosophy was simple: keep them busy, keep them healthy, prevent trouble. Bored, idle prisoners would cause problems. Engaged prisoners wouldn't. So camps had extensive recreational facilities. Many had soccer fields, football as the prisoners called it. Soccer leagues formed with teams from different barracks competing against each other. Championships were held. Some camps had baseball fields, and Germans learned this strange American game, often becoming quite good at it. There were volleyball courts, boxing rings, basketball courts. Sports equipment was provided by the Army or purchased through the YMCA, which had programs for POWs. Education was heavily encouraged. The Army believed that occupying prisoners' minds would prevent political radicalization and make them easier to manage. So camps established schools. Prisoners taught each other languages. English was the most popular for obvious reasons, but also French, Spanish, and Latin. They taught mathematics, history, science. Some camps offered vocational training. A prisoner could learn carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, auto mechanics. These skills would prove invaluable after the war when they returned to a Germany that needed rebuilding. Art and music flourished in ways that seem almost impossible given the circumstances.
Prisoners formed orchestras and bands. They performed classical music, Beethoven, Bach, Wagner, but also jazz, which many heard for the first time in America and loved despite Nazi propaganda condemning it as degenerate. Theatrical groups formed. They wrote and performed plays, from classical German theater to comedy skits mocking camp life and even the war. Prisoners built elaborate sets, designed costumes from whatever materials they could scrounge, and put on productions that rivaled community theater in American towns. Visual artists painted and drew. Some camps had art classes. Prisoners painted landscapes, portraits, scenes from memory of Germany. Some of this art still exists, housed in local museums near former campsites. There was also craft work. Prisoners carved wooden figurines, built model ships, created intricate metalwork using scrap materials. Some sold these items to guards or local civilians, earning extra money. Religious life was accommodated. Most prisoners were Christian, Lutheran, Catholic, or other Protestant denominations. The army provided chaplains or allowed civilian clergy to visit. Churches were established within camps. Prisoners could attend services, observe religious holidays. Christmas in the camps was particularly poignant. Services, decorations, sometimes even Christmas trees and special meals. Libraries existed in almost every camp. The YMCA and the International Red Cross supplied books in German, classical literature, contemporary novels, non-fiction, textbooks. Some camps had thousands of books. Prisoners read voraciously, everything from Goethe to American westerns translated into German. Newspapers were allowed, though the army controlled which ones. Prisoners could read American newspapers, many learned English specifically to do this, and some German-language papers published in the U.S., though obviously not Nazi propaganda sheets.
But here's where we hit a darker undercurrent that ran through camp life. Not all prisoners were happy to be there, and not all were willing to abandon their Nazi beliefs. The U.S. Army faced a serious problem. They had captured not just ordinary soldiers, but true believers, SS members, Hitler Youth, fanatical Nazi Party members. These men didn't see their capture as the end of their fight. They saw the camps as extensions of the battlefield. In many camps, hardcore Nazis organized themselves into secret groups. They intimidated other prisoners, preventing them from cooperating with Americans or learning about democracy. They held secret courts, tried fellow prisoners for treason against Germany, and sometimes executed those verdicts. Yes, executed. There were murders in POW camps, prisoners killed by other prisoners for being traitors. These traitors might be men who learned English too well, who expressed doubt about the Nazi cause, who befriended American guards, or who simply seemed too happy about their circumstances. The most infamous case occurred at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma in 1943. A prisoner named Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by fellow POWs for allegedly giving information to American authorities. His killers, 5 men, were identified, tried by U.S. military tribunal, convicted, and hanged. It was a brutal reminder that even in the relative comfort of American camps, the war's hatreds persisted. The Army responded by trying to segregate prisoners by political affiliation. They created separate camps for hardcore Nazis and for anti-Nazis, prisoners who had renounced Hitler or who were willing to cooperate with re-education programs. This wasn't always successful. Identifying who was truly a Nazi and who was just going along to avoid trouble was difficult. Prisoners lied, concealed their beliefs, or changed their minds. The screening process was imperfect. But it revealed something important. Not all German soldiers were Nazis. Many were conscripts who had no choice about serving. Some were opportunists who joined the party for career advancement but didn't believe the ideology. Some had always harbored doubts. And some, confronted with the reality of America, its prosperity, its diversity, its freedoms, began to question what they'd been told. These men became the focus of what the Army called intellectual diversion, but what was really re-education.
The U.S. government launched a covert program called the Intellectual Diversion Program, which was really an attempt to deprogram Nazi ideology and introduce prisoners to democratic ideals. This was overseen by the Office of the Provost Marshal General's Special Projects Division, working with the Office of War Information. They faced a delicate challenge. How do you change minds without appearing to propagandize? How do you teach democracy to men who've been raised on authoritarianism? The approach was subtle. Rather than direct lectures about how Nazism was evil, which would trigger defensive reactions, the program exposed prisoners to American life and let them draw their own conclusions. This happened through multiple channels. First, carefully selected books and periodicals. The camp libraries weren't just random collections, they were curated to include works on democracy, American history, biographies of founding fathers, and importantly, works by German authors who opposed Nazism or authoritarianism, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and others. Second, newspapers. Prisoners had access to Der Ruf, The Call, a German-language newspaper written by and for POWs, but secretly guided by American intelligence. It appeared to be neutral, just reporting news and printing prisoner essays and stories, but it subtly promoted democratic values, highlighted Nazi atrocities as they came to light, and featured articles by former prisoners who had embraced democracy. Third, education programs that emphasized critical thinking. Courses in American history, government, and economics weren't presented as America is great, Germany is bad. They were presented academically. Here's how the American system works. Here's how it was founded. Here are its principles. Prisoners were encouraged to ask questions, debate, think critically. For men who'd been raised in a system that demanded obedience and conformity, this was revolutionary. Fourth, and perhaps most powerful, direct interaction with Americans. Prisoners who worked on farms and in communities met ordinary Americans. They saw that the propaganda was lies. Americans weren't all warmongers or Jewish conspirators. They were farmers, shopkeepers, families. They were kind, often generous. Many prisoners were invited to American homes for dinner. Yes, enemy soldiers eating at the family table, discussing life and the war. These personal connections did more to change hearts than any lecture could. The program had varying success. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis until the end and beyond. After the war, some returned to Germany and continued to espouse Nazi ideology, but many others changed. Post-war surveys and interviews suggested that perhaps 10 to 15% of prisoners underwent genuine ideological conversion, becoming committed to democratic ideals. Another 30 to 40% became pragmatic anti-Nazis, not necessarily embracing democracy passionately, but rejecting the Hitler regime. The rest remained either indifferent or quietly resistant.
Despite the relatively comfortable conditions, some prisoners did try to escape. But here's the fascinating thing. Most escape attempts weren't desperate bids for freedom. They were adventurous, almost larks. Why? Because where were you going to go? A German prisoner escaping in rural Iowa or Mississippi had nowhere to run. They didn't speak English well enough to blend in, they had no contacts, no money beyond their meager earnings, no way to get back to Germany. Even if they reached Mexico or Canada, then what? Both countries would just return them to U.S. custody. The most famous escape attempt occurred in December 1944 from Camp Papago Park in Arizona. 25 German prisoners, mostly U-boat officers and submariners, spent months digging a tunnel. They succeeded in escaping, planning to reach Mexico and from there somehow get back to Germany. Within weeks, all were recaptured. The last one, Georg Gartner, actually did evade capture, but not by fleeing. He assumed a false identity and lived in America for 40 years, working odd jobs, eventually settling in California.
He finally revealed himself in 1985, an old man who had made America his home despite being a fugitive. His story illustrates a strange irony. The escapee who succeeded was the one who chose to stay. Most prisoners didn't try to escape because, frankly, camp life was better than the alternatives. Better than combat, better than bombed cities, better than poverty. Some camps had such low security that prisoners could theoretically walk away at any time, but they didn't. There are documented cases of prisoners leaving camp, with permission or without, to go into nearby towns, then returning on their own. Why? Because they had regular meals, a bed, safety, and a community. Outside, they were alone in a foreign country.
The relationship between POWs and American civilians is one of the most complex and fascinating aspects of this story. Officially, interaction was restricted. Prisoners weren't supposed to fraternize with civilians beyond what was necessary for work. But rules and reality diverged, especially in small towns where the camps became part of the community fabric. In many rural areas, the arrival of a POW camp was the most exciting thing to happen in years. For towns that had lost their young men to the war, suddenly there were thousands of young men, albeit enemy soldiers, working local farms and businesses. Curiosity was inevitable. So was commerce. Prisoners with money wanted to buy things. Local businesses wanted customers. A quiet trade often developed, technically against regulations, but tolerated. Friendships formed, particularly between prisoners and farmers they worked for. A farmer might spend all day working alongside the same group of POWs. They'd share lunch, talk in broken English and German, joke around. The farmer might bring them lemonade on hot days, share cigarettes, even give them small gifts. Some farmers invited prisoners to their homes for dinner, wanting to show hospitality or curious about Germany. These interactions were transformative. One former prisoner recalled, "The farmer I worked for, he treated me like a person, not an enemy. He asked about my family. He showed me pictures of his son who was fighting in France. We were not so different." Romantic relationships occurred, though they were strictly forbidden and could result in severe punishment for both parties. Nevertheless, lonely people are lonely people, war or not. There are documented cases of American women, often farm girls or women in rural towns, developing relationships with German POWs. These were dangerous liaisons. If discovered, the woman faced social ostracism and the prisoner faced punishment, transfer, or worse. Yet they happened. Some continued after the war, with former POWs returning to America to marry women they'd met during captivity. The African American experience with POWs was complex and troubling. In the segregated South, German prisoners often received better treatment than Black Americans. They could eat in restaurants where Black people couldn't, stay in hotels that excluded Black guests, and in some cases even sit in whites-only sections of buses and trains, while Black American soldiers fighting for their country had to sit in the back. This hypocrisy was not lost on Black Americans, or ironically, on many German prisoners, some of whom found American racism shocking, given that America was fighting a war against Nazi racial ideology. There's a famous account from a Black soldier who wrote, "The people of the town could understand the feelings of the German prisoners better than they could understand mine." This bitter reality highlighted the contradictions of American society, a nation fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to millions at home.
Here's something most people don't know. Many POW camps became remarkably self-sufficient, almost like small towns. Prisoners didn't just work outside the camps, they worked inside them too, creating goods and services for themselves and sometimes for the broader army. This was both practical and strategic. It kept men busy, developed skills, and reduced costs. Camps had workshops where prisoners produced furniture, repaired equipment, and manufactured items needed for camp life. There were bakeries where prisoners baked bread not just for themselves, but sometimes for nearby army bases.
There were tailor shops where uniforms were mended and altered. Some camps had print shops that produced camp newspapers, posters, and educational materials. These weren't crude operations. Many prisoners were skilled craftsmen, and they took pride in their work. Agricultural work happened inside camps, too. Many camps had gardens where prisoners grew vegetables to supplement their rations. Some had entire farms attached to them, with prisoners raising chickens, pigs, or cattle. The produce and livestock were used to feed the camp population, with surplus sometimes sold. This created a strange circular economy. Prisoners produced food, which reduced government costs, which justified continuing the program. There were also cultural industries. The theatrical productions I mentioned earlier weren't small affairs. Some camps built elaborate theaters with stages, curtains, lighting systems, all constructed by prisoners. Sets were built, costumes sewn, programs printed. Performances were regular events, attended by other prisoners and sometimes by American guards and local civilians who were invited. It was entertainment, but it was also a link to home, a way to maintain German culture and identity in a foreign land. This self-sufficiency had an unintended consequence. It created a sense of normalcy, even permanence. Prisoners began to feel less like captives and more like residents. They took ownership of their spaces, improved their barracks, decorated common areas. Some camps had flower gardens, painted murals, hand-carved signs. This wasn't confinement in the traditional sense, it was community building.
May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. You might think this would mean immediate freedom for POWs, but it didn't. In fact, most German prisoners remained in American camps for another year or more. Why? Because Germany was in ruins. There was no infrastructure to receive hundreds of thousands of returning POWs. There was barely enough food for the existing population. Allied authorities in occupied Germany asked the U.S. to keep the prisoners longer, to release them gradually as conditions improved. For prisoners, VE Day was complex emotionally. Relief that the war was over, certainly, but also grief and anxiety. Many hadn't heard from families in months or years. They didn't know if their loved ones were alive, if their homes still stood. As information about the destruction of German cities became available, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin reduced to rubble, prisoners faced the reality that they might have nothing to return to. And then came the revelations about the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities, the full scope of the concentration camps, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the medical experiments, the death marches. All of this began to emerge. American authorities made sure prisoners learned about it. They showed them newsreels of Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. They made them read accounts, look at photographs. The goal was denazification, force them to confront what their nation had done. Reactions varied. Some prisoners were horrified, genuinely shocked. They claimed they had no idea, that they'd been ordinary soldiers fighting for Germany, not for genocide. Some had suspected something was wrong, but not the scale. Others remained in denial, insisting it was Allied propaganda. A few, the hardcore Nazis, didn't care or even approved. These screenings created intense debates within camps. Friendships fractured, fistfights broke out. Some prisoners suffered psychological breakdowns, unable to reconcile their identity as Germans with the atrocities committed in Germany's name. For American authorities, this was the culmination of the re-education effort. They wanted prisoners to return to Germany not as unreconstructed Nazis, but as men who understood the catastrophic failure of Nazi ideology. Success varied, but the seeds were planted.
Repatriation began in early 1946 and continued through late 1946 and into 1947. Prisoners were shipped home in stages, usually based on when they'd been captured. Those captured earliest went home first, and on their work assignments, Essential agricultural workers were kept longer, often until after harvest season. This created resentment among prisoners who felt they were being exploited, kept in America to work while others went home. The journey back was bittersweet. Prisoners boarded the same ships that had brought them, crossing the Atlantic again, but this time heading toward an uncertain future. On board, many reflected on their time in America. Letters and diaries from this period reveal complex feelings: gratitude for having survived the war relatively unscathed, nostalgia for the friendships and experiences of camp life, apprehension about what awaited them in Germany. Upon arrival in German ports, the contrast was stark. The America they'd left, prosperous, intact, vibrant, was nothing like the Germany they returned to. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, the economy was in collapse, food was scarce, the social order had disintegrated. Millions of displaced persons wandered the landscape. The occupation forces, American, British, French, and Soviet, controlled everything. Germany had been divided into zones. Families were scattered or dead. The future was bleak. For men who had spent years in comfortable American camps, eating regular meals, working productively, even enjoying recreation and culture, this was devastating. Some later admitted that their time in America had been the best years of their lives, a disturbing realization for men who had been prisoners of their nation's enemy. There's a documented phenomenon of reverse culture shock among returning POWs. They struggled to adjust to scarcity, chaos, and the psychological trauma of defeat. Many put their American-acquired skills to use. Those who'd learned trades, carpentry, electrical work, mechanics, found employment in the reconstruction effort. Those who'd learned English had an advantage in dealing with occupation authorities or in the emerging new economy. Some used money they'd saved from POW wages to start small businesses or help their families. The labor experience, intended to support American agriculture, became unexpectedly valuable for rebuilding Germany.
Here's where the story takes an unexpected final turn. Thousands of former POWs eventually returned to America, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. The numbers are difficult to pin down precisely, but estimates suggest that between 5,000 and 10,000 former German POWs emigrated to the United States in the years and decades after the war. Why would men return to the country that had held them captive? Several reasons emerge from interviews and historical accounts. First, economic opportunity. Post-war Germany was struggling. America was booming. Men who'd worked American farms or businesses during the war knew there were opportunities. They'd seen the prosperity firsthand. Some had kept in touch with farmers they'd worked for, who offered them jobs if they could immigrate. Second, personal connections. The romantic relationships I mentioned earlier sometimes endured. Men returned to marry women they'd met during captivity, building families and lives in America. Third, ideological alignment. Some had genuinely embraced democracy during their re-education and found the new democratic West Germany still too conservative, too haunted by the past. America represented a fresh start. The immigration process wasn't easy. Former POWs had to apply like any other immigrant, meeting quotas and requirements. But they had advantages. They spoke English. They understood American culture. They often had job offers waiting. Many settled in the same communities where they'd been held as prisoners. A former POW might return to Iowa and buy the farm he'd once worked as a captive, or settle in Texas and open a business in the town near his old camp. These men became bridges between nations, living reminders of a strange chapter in history. They raised children who were fully American, but grew up hearing stories about Papa's time as a POW, about the war, about the complexity of loyalty and identity. Some became active in veterans organizations, both American and German, working toward reconciliation.
Others simply lived quiet lives, their POW experience a private memory.
Let's address the elephant in the room, the moral complexity of treating enemy soldiers so well while the war was still raging. Some Americans at the time were outraged. Their sons, husbands, and brothers were fighting and dying in Europe and the Pacific. Meanwhile, German prisoners were living relatively comfortable lives, earning wages, playing sports, and attending concerts. Letters to newspapers and to the War Department complained about this. Why were we treating them so well? The official answers were practical: Geneva Convention compliance, economic necessity, and strategic benefit. But there were moral dimensions too. American leaders believed that humane treatment was right, regardless of what the enemy had done. It was a reflection of American values, a demonstration that democracy and human rights weren't just propaganda, but principles. Treating POWs well was a way of proving that the Allies were better than the Axis, not in rhetoric, but in practice. There was also a forward-looking calculation. World War I's harsh treatment of defeated Germany had contributed to resentment, economic collapse, and the rise of Nazism. American planners were determined not to repeat that mistake. Treating German soldiers humanely, re-educating them in democratic values, and sending them home as potential allies in rebuilding a democratic Germany was an investment in the future. It was the same logic that would later produce the Marshall Plan: generosity toward former enemies to build a better peace. But this logic had blind spots. While German POWs were treated well, Japanese POWs often weren't, facing harsher conditions and more suspicion, reflecting the intense racial hatred of the Pacific War. And the contrast with how America treated its own black citizens remained a glaring hypocrisy. The same nation that fed and paid German prisoners upheld Jim Crow laws, denied voting rights, and tolerated lynchings. These contradictions complicate any simple narrative of American moral superiority.
So, what are we to make of this story? The tale of 400,000 German prisoners of war living in America, working on farms, earning wages, gaining weight, playing soccer, learning English, and in many cases, having better lives than they'd had in years. It's strange and unsettling and profoundly human all at once. It reveals that even in total war, there are spaces for humanity, for pragmatism, for thinking beyond the immediate conflict. It shows that people are not simple categories, enemy and friend, good and evil, but complex individuals shaped by circumstance. German soldiers weren't all Nazis, and recognizing their humanity didn't mean excusing the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The POW program was imperfect. It had contradictions and failures, but it also had unexpected successes. It kept men alive who might have died. It contributed to agricultural production during a critical time. It planted seeds of democratic thought in men who would return to help rebuild Germany. And it created thousands of personal stories of friendships, transformations, and unlikely connections across the divides of war. Today, as we face new conflicts and debates about how to treat enemies, refugees, and prisoners, this history offers lessons. Humane treatment isn't just morally right, it's strategically smart. People can change. Former enemies can become allies, and sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see the humanity in those we've been taught to hate. The next time you drive through rural Iowa or Texas or any of the hundreds of places where these camps once stood, remember, beneath those fields, there's a hidden history of German voices singing in makeshift theaters, of men learning English from worn textbooks, of enemies becoming neighbors, and of a strange chapter of World War II that most of us never learned in school. That history matters. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, there's room for unexpected light.